All right, well, welcome again, everyone, as we take our Ask Me Anything motto to a live question and answer series with today's webinar focusing on content distribution. I'm Alicia Pack. I'm a technical copywriter here at Rusticy Software, and I'll be your moderator throughout these webinars. And they've tasked me with wrangling our two speakers today, Andy Whitaker and Joe Donnelly. And while these two really don't need an introduction, I'll have them introduce each other. Andy, do you want to start?
I will start. It's with great pleasure to introduce Joe Donnelly. Many of you probably know Joe because he is the person that helps everyone that comes through Rusticy Software for the most part. If it's not his brother Ryan, also maybe helping out from time to time. Joe's been with us for 16 years.
14 on Sunday.
14 on Sunday. It's a big anniversary week for Joe. Has been talking about these things for a long time, these things being e-learning standards and all aspects of the standards, from how to implement them to how to troubleshoot them. And the topic that we're going to be talking about today is using them for distribution of content as well. So yeah, so that's Joe. Probably more to say about Joe, but I'm going to leave it there so that he can, dote on me next.
So when people ask me to describe Andy Whitaker, full-time standards expert, full-time sales professional, part-time college DJ. That's where if you had your hair down, it would be so much better, but it's not. And full-time product owner of my heart. Andy also has a great anniversary in that it is his 10-year anniversary with Rusticy tomorrow. So we're very excited about that. We celebrate anniversaries as much as we can, and that's a big one. So really happy to be talking with Andy and y'all today, and yeah, we'll see what kind of questions we get.
All right, and I want to say a big thank you to everyone who submitted questions ahead of time for us to answer live today. We want these webinars to really be all about you and the questions that you have. So today's webinar centers around content distribution, and after compiling your questions, we broke the webinar down into a few topics. We'll start with e-learning standards, and then we'll chat about publishing and distributing content. And we'll end with some questions about how Rusticy products themselves handle content distribution. So on the webinar today, about 60% of our attendees marked they're knowledgeable about the topic, with about 30% saying they're aware but don't know much. And as a reminder, this webinar will be recorded and you'll be sent a link once it's ready. And that email will also compile any helpful links and resources that we talk about today. But to start us off, Joe, will you tell us what content distribution is?
So content distribution, basically it's how are you going to deliver this content that you have? Chances are you've got some sort of SCORM content, some sort of XAPI content, maybe CMI5 if you're getting into that, and you need a way to deliver that content. And sometimes it's not as easy as sending something to somebody to put in their LMS, their training delivery system, and you need another tool to help get you down that path.
And Andy, why is that important?
Well, I mean, content is king, but you've got to have, in most cases, a system for delivering it. So getting content from an authoring tool where you're going to typically create that e-learning content into a typically standards-based format, ultimately getting that to an end user, to a learner, is the last mile. And so how you go about sharing content from the tool that you've created, the file that you've downloaded into that learning system, there's a lot of considerations that go into that based on things like who owns the content, where the content needs to be accessed from, various things like that. I know we're going to get into all of that today. So there's a lot to unpack around distribution, ways that the standards themselves have some built-in capabilities to help with that. And then, we'll talk about some of our solutions as well, for helping people achieve various things. Yeah.
And on that note, what role do standards play in content distribution?
So from a SCORM perspective, since that's the most ubiquitous, I'll start there and let Joe chime in with other thoughts. SCORM in and of itself is really a content interoperability standard. A big part of the SCORM standard is to govern how this content is packaged so that it can be brought into any SCORM conformant learning system. So it is inherently a standard around making content compatible with LMSs. There's some limitations around that, that, we offer some solutions that can help sort of get around some of those limitations, but SCORM enables as a starting place for you to create content in any tool and make it available through any LMS that also supports SCORM. So there is a portability sort of aspect to SCORM. AICC has some things that I'm not as smart as Joe on that help with those. CMI5 and XAPI to a certain degree are also helping with some of those things. I'm gonna let Joe chime in with some thoughts.
So, and the other thing that your standards are gonna kind of help govern is what kind of reporting you're gonna get. That is gonna be a big factor in choosing the standard that you want to deliver to either your third parties or to your learners themselves. So if you find that you want to report on question and answer data, your normal big four, so completion, success status, score, and time, then SCORM will do it for you. But then those other standards like XAPI and CMI5 will let you kind of branch out and kind of break the shackles of the SCORM spec, and really of your training delivery system in some cases, depending upon how you're going to distribute it. So really what you're looking to report. And then the other factor with standards is if you are going to deliver this to a third party that's going to deliver it through their LMS, what does their LMS support? So you could have this amazing piece of XAPI content that does this crazy reporting that you can get just great detailed information. But if that third party only supports SCORM 1.2, how do you get it there?
Right. I want to also, I guess, come back to, inherent in the standards, SCORM is not a great standard if you are wanting to provide remote access to your content. The SCORM standard really requires that the content reside on the same domain as the system that's launching it, where the learner is accessing it from, as it states in the standard itself, or what the standard on its own allows for. There are some other opportunities, though, and this is where a standard as old as AICC can sometimes become interesting to folks. If you're just looking at how can I develop content, make it available through a third-party LMS, just using the standard itself, then there are pieces to AICC that help with that cross-domain capability. CMI5 can be similar to that. The content that the CMI5 package represents doesn't necessarily have to be inside the package itself. It could reside elsewhere. It's not a packaging standard, but LTI also works in a similar way, where content can reside in a specific learning tool, and then LTI would enable that tool or that activity to be accessed from some remote third-party learning system. So where we have some solutions that help solve the problem that Joe specifically referred to, which is I've got XAPI content I need to make available in a SCORM conformant LMS. If you want to go out on your own and not use software that an organization like Rustici provides, there are specific standards that you could look to follow that enable this this cross-domain capability.
All right, so I heard a little bit about CMI5. What advantages does CMI5 have over SCORM, and do you think it'll replace SCORM in the near future?
You want to take that one first, Joe?
It's a great question. As some of you have talked to me before, I usually describe myself as a SCORM dinosaur. I love SCORM. I would love to see SCORM have another 10 to 15 years of life, but that's just personal. You can probably see my gray hair. Oh my goodness, my gray hair. So 10 to 15 years, y'all, let's keep it. But CMI5 does some super interesting things in that it will allow you to kind of harness some of the power of XAPI, since it's an XAPI profile, so that you not only can push runtime data into your normal reports, but then you can also branch out and maybe use statement forwarding, and because you're populating an LRS at the same time, which haven't covered LRSs and LMSs yet, but I think that's coming up. But you are populating your learning record store with statements that you can then pipe to analytics products, and you can do that in a very easy way. Whereas with SCORM, while in a lot of cases, the reporting that comes along with SCORM works for people, and it will populate their reports in a way that they want, but you are kind of governed by that spec and what you can report on, whereas CMI5 kind of opens things up.
Yeah, and I would just tack on the sort of remote access that CMI5 can introduce as well. Since we're in the topic of content distribution, a lot of times when we hear and talk to people about content distribution, what they're really seeking or looking for is a way to control their content while sharing it with a third-party system, because this is intellectual property that they've built themselves, they've invested a lot into. They want to make sure that it's being used in the right way by whoever they're sharing it with. And so CMI5 can start to introduce as a standard on its own this opportunity to do some third-party LMS access. I don't know if this question was coming up as a follow-up, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it anyways, which is why is CMI5 not as good as SCORM quite yet, Joe? Do you have an answer to that?
Well, people are still implementing it. It's still new. It's still a baby. And SCORM is what, trying to remember, is it 2000? It's been around a long time. So it's had a lot of traction. We've got a lot of SCORM implementations out in the world. And with CMI5, we have authoring tools just now starting to implement that as a publishing output. So because of that, some of the LMSs are kind of following suit and starting to support it. But I think that's really the big thing, because you know, right now, last year with Project Catapult and the test suite, it has all the things it needs. It's just we need people to use it.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great lead into, can you put CMI5 or XAPI conformant content into an LMS that only supports SCORM?
No, not in the way that you would put SCORM into that LMS, right? So, you know, the LMS needs the understanding of what to do with that package. If it's an older sort of tin can XAPI type package that might come from an authoring tool, the LMS has to implement something called the launch specification, which some LMSs have and some LMSs haven't. CMI5 has its own sort of processes for ingesting content and ultimately launching that content and tracking that content. So if your LMS only supports SCORM and you're wanting to start taking advantage of XAPI and CMI5 outputs from an authoring tool, for example, you know, we'll put the sales hat on for a second in these moments, because we have solutions that can help you solve that problem, and we do that for a lot of customers. So we'd be happy to talk about that if that's something that you're moving towards or interested in as a potential future state. But it requires some additional technology in order to pull that off. Alternatively, I'll add one more thing, because I can hear, for folks that maybe have had a chance to listen to Brian Miller talk over the years, who's one of our XAPI gurus, there are some folks out in the world that have decided to create a SCORM package and enable that SCORM package to generate XAPI data and send that into a learning record store. That is something that we have seen. It is something that we get asked about from time to time. We put a big caution flag around that. We wave a big caution flag when anytime somebody comes to us with that idea. And not to get too into the weeds, but it's because in order for that SCORM package to also share XAPI data with a learning record store, you have to hard code the endpoint for that LRS into the package itself. And someone who knows what they're doing with a browser console and inspect element could find your LRS endpoint, would have your username and credentials, and could pump all sorts of data into that LRS without you being aware of them doing it until it ends up there. And maybe you've got a bunch of statements that shouldn't be in your learning record store. So it is something that we've seen. It's something that people are doing. It is something that we do not recommend to do because it just opens up your LRS to receiving all sorts of sort of nefarious or malicious things.
So if someone wants to consume their own courses that they're building, and they also want to share that content out using a sharing standard, but they don't want to have too much additional development work, why should or shouldn't they continue to adopt CMI5? So they'll be sharing out with SCORM, but are thinking maybe for internal purposes that CMI5 would be a good fit.
It's an interesting question, and it kind of lends to, once again, like Andy was saying, putting on the sales hat. If you could have some sort of, I mean, there are off-the-shelf tools that we sell, and I think there's a handful of others out there where you can host that CMI5 package in your LMS and then share from your LMS to another LMS that possibly doesn't support CMI5, pushing the runtime data so they can report it on the LMS side of things. I'm allowed to name products, right? Like Content Controller does this. This is what it does. Dispatch, same thing, where you can take a standard, share out as another standard so that you can cover all the bases. You get the nice, robust runtime data on your side, and you are pushing a version of the data over to the third party in a language it understands. Did I answer the question? That was, sorry, did I understand the answers?
Yes, you did.
Yeah. All right, again.
I also want to say that if you have questions and you want to ask Andy and Joe as we go along, please feel free to add those into the chat or the QA tab. Tara is on the line with us and she's helping us kind of go through those. So we'll make sure those get answered. To go kind of back to XAPI a little bit, what's the distribution differences between using CMI5 and XAPI?
Joe, you might have a little bit more insight into this. I have sort of a general answer, but
why don't you do your general answer and I can maybe add color.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm going to talk about it not so much from a distribution perspective initially, and then maybe Joe can tack that on. But there's a key distinction between an XAPI package and a CMI5 package in that an XAPI package, there's nothing governing what that particular package has to generate from a data perspective. And so in the early days of XAPI packages, it's a bit of the Wild West. Authoring tools can use that as an output. And inside of that package, it could be generating all sorts of different statements, but nothing was telling it what it had to generate from a data perspective. And that's really where part of CMI5 becomes really interesting, is that from, if you can imagine, in working with a learning management system, they're so used to having a prescribed way of doing things and understanding going in to launching something like a SCORM package, what kind of data they're going to get back from that package. And knowing that in advance is really important for an LMS so that they can provide the types of reports that their customers might be interested in. And so the XAPI package in sort of the old world was very scary to an LMS because they didn't know what to expect from that package. And so a lot of them just said, there's too many unknowns, we're not going to touch it. Some of them did, but a lot of them didn't. And so CMI5 is being introduced as, I think, from my perspective, as a way to get more LMSs on board with XAPI, because CMI5 has a specific set of statements that a package has to generate in a particular order in order for it to be conformant with the spec. And LMSs love that kind of stuff. So that's kind of my take on that. From a distribution side of things, I'm not sure a real difference other than still having that sort of known set of statements that the activity will generate from the CMI5 package then under the hood, wherever that activity resides, additional statements could be shared back into the LMS, and that other activity in both cases could reside on an entirely different domain or or website or whatever it might be. But I'm going to stop talking before I say something that's not right.
No, that's great. I mean, what I was going to add is, so yeah, XAPI, one of its chief bits of why people use it is that it does kind of unshackle you from the LMS. You don't need it. A lot of back in the day, like Andy said, a lot of LMSs didn't know what to do with it. There was no launch spec. There's no packaging spec. It kind of could be an entity sending something to somewhere. Well, that somewhere being a learning record store. And it kind of left a lot of LMS vendors and training delivery systems in a situation kind of like a, who's going to make my sandwich situation. And then there's CMI5. And CMI5 is the sandwich for them. Like, it does all of the things in the order that they expect. It has a package. It is something it can consume. And it also allows you, like I was saying earlier, to do all the stuff that an XAPI package or a tin can package would do, populating an LRS and doing the cool stuff. But yeah.
Yeah, but from a
little bit of,
yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Alicia.
But is it a sandwich or is it a soup?
It's a sandwich. 100% is a sandwich because it's got layers, it's got things it has to do. Well, no, soups are, oh, that's a whole other podcast. Yeah. Sorry, Andy, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I don't know that there's, the only real difference, I think, from a distribution perspective is that the system that's launching the CMI5 package will know what it's going to get from that launch and from a data perspective. And that can be really important to whatever system is launching it. Again, beyond that, the activity that the CMI5 package is launching ultimately, which could live somewhere else, is ultimately sharing XAPI statements back into the learning record store that it's been authenticated against, just like an XAPI package would do. But if it's an XAPI package, there's a lot of unknowns to the launching system about what data to expect. That's the key distinction, I think, there.
Before we move into our next question about publishing, can you describe what a learning record store is?
Yeah, so I'll talk about it from a couple different perspectives. There is the definition of the learning record store inside the XAPI specification. And then there are learning record stores that you can purchase off the shelf from people out in the world. The learning record store, as it pertains to the specification, is very specific in it is the destination for XAPI statements from an XAPI conformant learning record provider. For those folks that have been around a long time, they used to be called activity providers. They are now LRPs, or learning record providers. But every learning record provider that conforms to the spec needs to send its data to a learning record store, ideally one that is conformant with the spec as well. And so from a spec perspective, it is the place where the statements get sent, where they get stored, and where they can be retrieved from. And there's some other bits around that. There's authentication and things like that. But that is really it. It is the repository for statements. Now, if you go out into the world and you start Googling, I want a learning record store, most people think about an LRS in more of a way of like learning analytics or a reporting tool. And so you might look at a sister company like Watershed or the open source LRS Learning Locker. There's Yet Analytics, there's Veracity, there's a bunch of them now sort of on the scene. And those I would call LRS-based reporting tools or LRS-based analytic tools. Most of them have an XAPI conformant learning record store inside of it. That's how the data gets into a tool like Watershed. But then they've built a lot of non-spec related technology on top of it. The LRS, the spec, XAPI spec, doesn't tell an LRS how it has to report on data or how it has to visualize this data. At least it doesn't yet. And so every LRS provider out there, like a Watershed or Learning Locker, has decided how they want to represent that data from a data visualization and reporting perspective. So those are really the two types of learning record stores. Rustlessly Software provides one that's like a headless LRS that's intended to become a part of another application. It doesn't provide all the cool charts and graphs that something like Watershed or Veracity would provide.
All right, some authoring tools are starting to ask new publishing questions. So it asks, are you publishing to an LRS or an LMS? What's the difference between publishing to an LRS versus publishing to an LMS?
So it's an interesting question, and I think it needs to probably be phrased a little bit differently if the authoring tools are if their output looks like that, because the thing to remember, one, I forget how much I enjoy listening to Andy talk about XAPI. I haven't gotten a chance to do that in a while, but with the LRS isn't actually like delivering something. It's just receiving statements. And so really, with respect to the output from the authoring tool, I would probably say publishing to send to an LRS or publishing for LMS. Whereas the LMS is the learning management system, the training delivery system, the thing that's going to take the package and import it and then launch it, and then using the standards, do all the things that it does. But publishing for an LRS means you're probably publishing XAPI. Maybe they can shoehorn CMI5 in there that is going to natively send statements to an LRS.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. That's great. Good job, Joe.
Thanks, Andy. I appreciate that compliment.
All right, and once you've published, can your content be secured once it's shared out?
Yes. You know, if you're using a standard on its own, then some of them have, this is where my knowledge of CMI5 is going to maybe fall short a little bit, but I believe CMI5 has some concepts of that. I don't believe AICC does. I might be wrong there as far as kind of securing content. In most of these packaging standards, though, the learner is, launching a .zip file from a learning management system. But in the case where maybe the content doesn't reside or the activity doesn't exist within that file itself, it lives on a different web server or on a different domain, ideally you would have things set up to where the only way that you could access that activity is by launching the file, the package from the learning management system. And there wouldn't be a way to come to that activity directly if you are looking to secure the activity that's being launched from the LMS. It's a big part of what we do from a software perspective when it comes to content distribution. And again, not to spend a lot of time on it, but it's a big aspect of what we're doing, because our customers that use a content distribution tool that we offer, something like a content controller, that is a big reason why they're using that solution, is to protect their intellectual property while making it available, distributing it to a third-party LMS that perhaps one of their customers are using, or a reseller is using, or something like that. So we have technology that enables that to be that content that's being launched ultimately to be inaccessible outside of the package that's being launched from the learning management system. And now I'm going to ask Joe's question that he asked earlier. I don't know if I answered that question or not. Did I answer that question, Joe? Or do you have other things that you would add there?
I mean, it's a big question. I mean, it's kind of, it honestly is like when we were talking about XAPI and SCORM and the differences, it's a big question. It's probably bigger than a 45-minute webinar, because you can get into the, how is an LMS or TDS going to secure that content at runtime. Security is a little bit different, and that in itself, I mean, Mike Rusty himself wrote a really great article about SCORM and security that you can look up. It's on our site, but there are lots of different things, angles we could take. But I think you answered the question.
Yeah, if a deeper dive is of interest to anyone on the call around that, yeah, reach out to us and we're happy to talk more about it and get into the details of your world a bit more.
Right. And to move more into distribution, how can you distribute content without an LMS?
So it's going to be hard if you're publishing to a standard, is how I would first react to that question. If you're using an authoring tool and publishing it to SCORM, now that package needs a runtime environment to launch and operate within. So, you could, out of an authoring tool, you could publish for web, throw it up on a web server, make it available to learners in that way. But what you've done there is stripped out any sort of automated tracking that the standard would end up helping you with. So perhaps you're adding some of your own JavaScript tracking to that type of content. Again, it's always a little bit awkward because we want to be here to just offer good information and advice to folks coming to the call, and we try not to be salesy here, but we have a solution called SCORM Cloud that is a training delivery system, and lots of folks use that who don't have a learning management system but are still creating standards-based content from an authoring tool. You can import that into SCORM Cloud. Many of you are probably familiar with SCORM Cloud because that's where you test your content before taking it to an LMS perhaps. But SCORM Cloud has something called invitations that allow for you to just send a launch URL directly to a learner. And you can bypass an LMS entirely and still get all the great tracking data that the standard provides. So that's a path and something we'd be happy to talk about. But Joe, I don't know if you want to chime in with more.
No, I mean, I think that works. I mean, if you have development resources, I mean, technically you don't need an LMS for XAPI, but you would need a place to point the statements. We do have new functionality in Content Controller called CC Launcher that will allow you to host something in Content Controller and then create a link that will allow a learner to basically take the course without the LMS. You just need a server on your side of things. It's brand new. We've got some folks using it with success. But yeah, I mean, that's SCORM Cloud's. It was usually my go-to answer. Like, yeah, just use SCORM Cloud. It's so easy, and we'll help you use it.
Yeah. What platforms support dispatch? And can you talk a little bit about what we mean by dispatch?
Sure. So when we mean dispatch, we mean either, so SCORM Cloud has a dispatch functionality, our Rusticy engine has dispatch, it has an add-on for dispatch functionality, and then Content Controller has dispatch functionality, meaning that you are hosting your course in one of those entities, and then you're sharing out a proxy package that will be delivered through a learning management system or some other training delivery system that can speak that language. And so what we normally go by is if that third party that you're delivering to supports that standard, then you should be fine. So for SCORM Cloud, right now it supports SCORM 1.2 as output. So you can really cast like a wide net there because everybody supports SCORM 1.2. But if you ran into, I think we ran into an elusive version of Oracle a while back that only supported SCORM 2004 4th edition, you can use Content Controller and also Rusticy Engine to share out as those standards. Andy, did I miss anything?
Yeah, I would just add, we work with different types of organizations that are customers of ours. A lot of them are a content creator. They're a content publisher. They use an authoring tool. They are not software developers, right? And so if you fall into the content provider, content publisher category, and you need this sort of dispatching capability that Joe was describing, we would talk about SCORM Cloud Dispatch or Content Controller. The Rusticy Dispatch, or the Engine plus Dispatch solution that we offer, is better suited if you are a learning platform provider. You're an LMS provider, or LXP, whatever we're calling these types of applications these days, and you want to introduce distribution capabilities into your learning system. Then we have an integrated product, which we tend to do from time to time, that can become a part of your learning system and add the dispatching capability to your application. So there's paths there, just depending on who you are, the type of organization you are, and what you're trying to accomplish. But those are really the three big ones. I would also throw something called Rusticy cross-domain into the mix there. If you have a website that's got videos on it and you're being asked to make those videos available through a SCORM conformant LMS, Rusticy cross-domain can help you kind of dispatch that content. We do it in a slightly different way from a technical perspective, but Rusticy cross-domain is the way to get just standard web content that doesn't conform to a standard. It's just traditional web content available and accessible and tracked in a standards-based LMS. So that's another option. Always happy to talk about these things because it's nuanced, right? It's the details matter with the solution that we would end up recommending.
And before we go too much farther into our Rusticy products questions that we received, I wanted to say, if someone is starting their publishing and distribution journey and say they maybe want to add SCORM or CMI5, what's the best way to start distributing your content? Best place to start?
I've got a thought there. It's not what we would recommend doing, but it would be SCORM, and specifically SCORM 1.2, because it is the most ubiquitous version of SCORM out there. And give your content to whoever has the learning management system to deploy within it. You are distributing your content in that way, and you're using a ubiquitous standard to do that. It's one of the benefits of using the SCORM standard, especially SCORM 1.2, is that now your content is compatible with most LMSs and even a lot of LXPs who are begrudgingly, in a lot of cases, adopting standards. You have compatibility with a lot of different standards. Now, that is not our recommended approach to distribution, because, in a matter of minutes, you can start to think about all the pitfalls of that. Updating content becomes really challenging. You got to swap out all these files and all these different systems. You've lost control of that content, meaning you can't turn off access because they have the content itself living in the LMS. You have no visibility into how your content is being used by whatever learning system is launching it. But there's a lot of times where folks are just getting started out providing content. They're just starting to use an authoring tool and they just want to hit the ground running. And it in some cases is the best option for them to start with. And then perhaps over time, you start looking at other software or technology options that allow you to bring that control back in to your organization, and it makes life a bit easier, and ultimately does away with a lot of risks associated with just handing over the content itself.
Great. And we do have about 5 minutes left on this, but Andy and Joe will continue answering questions all the way up to 11. So be sure, if you have any questions, drop those in the chat or in our QA box and we'll have them answer. So we did receive some Rusticy products and questions and how they work with content distribution. So how does distributed content communicate between Rusticy and a client LMS?
It's really going to be via the standard that's used. So if you were to, well, just for the example we've been using, if you were to house an XAPI package in, we'll just say content controller, and you share it as SCORM 1.2, that dispatch package, that proxy package, is using the SCORM spec on that side of things to communicate. So we'll kind of follow suit as far as what standard you share out, and we will use that language so that the LMS can understand what's happening. And then on our side, in that example, we are sending XAPI statements to our LRS, and then if our client wants to forward those to another LRS, we can do that in the background too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the one that I think most times is most surprising to folks that we talk about, is that because up until using a solution like Content Controller, one of the questions that a content provider has to ask their customer is, what do I need to publish my content out to? What standard in order to be compatible with your learning management system? And in most cases, you were going lowest common denominator, which is SCORM 1.2, but the content publisher might actually want to publish a CMI5 or XAPI because it gives them more data about how learners are using their content. And so when we talk about this opportunity with something like Content Controller, where as a content owner, you can publish to any standard you want to, and maybe you choose XAPI or CMI5 because it gives you the most data and most insights about how learners are interacting with your content. But because we can still share that CMI5 or XAPI package out to a SCORM system, an AICC system, even an LTI-based LMS, you still get to appease the customer and deal with maybe their LMS that hasn't yet adopted some of these newer standards. So a lot of people are like, "Whoa, you can do that! That's amazing!" And it's kind of a fun moment because there's some magic there behind the scenes that's enabling that. So it's cool.
And as a follow-on to that question, which LMS, Rustices or the client's LMS, has the most accurate record of user activity?
So, Andy, do you want to take that one? I'm sorry, I saw you open your mouth. We've been
It's going to be, it's
we're like 45, well, close to 45 minutes in, and we haven't really stomped all over each other this whole time, which is pretty fantastic. I'll let you go. Go ahead.
It's good. It's going to be whatever system is hosting and playing the content. That is going to be the system of record in most cases from a data perspective. So if we go back to this content controller idea, the content's hosted in Content Controller, but being accessed through a third-party LMS. And again, the content, you could choose as a content owner to put CMI5 content in Content Controller. And that means Content Controller is going to start absorbing and storing a bunch of XAPI data from all those CMI5 packages, while you might be forced to share that content out to the third-party LMS using SCORM 1.2. So they're going to be limited to SCORM 1.2 data, which we call the big four: completion, pass, fail, score, and total time. So in that scenario, Content Controller is absolutely going to store more information about the learner's progress through the course, but the LMS will get the things that they typically care about and typically can report on as well. Most LMSs are built to do completion reporting or a score and maybe duration.
How does Rusticy approach web accessibility, and do your applications come with solutions out of the box that are compliant or support compliance?
We talked about this one the other day, I think, and I think with the answer we landed on was that Engine itself is 508 compliant, but the applications, well, one, in the Engine use case, we are going to be the plumbing in your application. So you'll want your application to handle that. From an accessibility standpoint, you would also want your courses, and this is where I usually land, is you would want your courses to be able to be captioned. In a lot of places, a lot of scenarios, that's going to be handled in your authoring tool. Same thing with mouse overs and all of these other things that we'd want to happen for a piece of content to be 508 compliant or to just be accessible. I would start at my content and work my way out, but I know Engine is 508 compliant. I missed something, Andy. What have I missed?
No, I think, and really the only time that it matters for Rusticy Engine is when the player is visible in the browser. And in the vast majority of cases, our player is not presented in the browser at all. Mostly just for multi-scope packages, which are a lot of times few and far between. But in the moments where it is, we actually worked with a customer who had a person on the team that I can't remember what they were dealing with in their lives that related to 508 compliance, but we were working closely with a team that helped us along those lines to make it as good as we possibly could. If you look at our other applications, we have SCORM Cloud, which has a web interface to it. We have Content Controller, which has a web interface to it. Our web applications are not 508 compliant, but the content that they distribute into the learning management system and the player that could be presented if they're a multi-scope package that we're presenting are. So really going back into Joe's comments, I think it starts with the content, making sure that's built in such a way to be compliant. And then in the moments where our technology shows up for an end user, that's where we have brought the 508 compliance into our technology. But the side of things that administrators of our applications interface with are not for now.
All right, Joe, this one's for you. In SCORM Cloud, will things get messed up if you change the name of a realm?
I don't think so. No, because the realm is just really the tag of the realm. The thing that kind of keeps everything together is the app ID.
Right.
And I don't think we let you mess with that. Or maybe we do. I'll have to ask Brian Donnelly.
And can you move lessons from one realm to another?
Unfortunately, no. No, you would need to re-import from realm to realm, app ID to app ID. So not at this time.
All right. And did we have anyone with any questions? Feel free to add those in the chat or give us a little emoji. One last question we have that goes back to standards. What improvements have been made with XAPI compared to SCORM 2004?
That's a big question. So one of the biggest things is the unshackling from the LMS. That's a big piece. The other big piece is that you're not really governed. Andy mentioned this earlier. You're not governed by a spec to say you must do this, this, and this, X, Y, and Z. It is the wild, wild west of learning standards. It's one of those things where when folks call us, email us, and support, and they ask about XAPI and can I do X, Y, and Z, chances are we always just say, yeah. Yeah, because we're not going to stop you from, or the spec isn't going to stop you from sending information that is important to you. It just needs to be sent in a valid statement, and your LRS has to be able to consume those statements. So that is really one of the big things. And it's what am I missing, Andy? I feel like
I think
it's an interesting question.
Yeah, if you're looking at sort of a comparison of what you might be interested in knowing about a piece of like authored content, then SCORM 2004 4th edition can start to bring higher fidelity information around interactions. So that's interesting. A lot of times people will lean on the Experience API for that as well, because you can get the full question text, you can get all the answer text and what answer was provided and was it correct or incorrect. But those are things that SCORM 2004 4th edition interactions can provide for the most part as well. Obviously, XAPI can do other things that SCORM can do: completion, pass, fail, score, total time. There's some things that 4th edition can do that Joe knows about that I don't. So I'm going to steer clear of going beyond that. But within an XAPI package, you can start to track other interactions with content or activities in the content itself that SCORM has no capability of providing you any visibility to, right? So if you want to know, that a PDF on a particular page in a course has been clicked on by a learner and downloaded, then an XAPI package could be instrumented in such a way to generate that type of statement when a link is clicked or when a video is interacted with, where SCORM is really not going to provide any real visibility into what a learner did inside of the course itself, other than those interactions from a quiz or an assessment.
Right. And some questions we had, we know that license renewals are always kind of a tricky thing. We hear about it a lot. So how can someone increase the number of license renewals they get for their courseware?
You have to turn off access at some point. That is how you do that, right? And so if you are just, again, going the sort of down and dirty way of just handing over SCORM packages, you might have an agreement in place with that customer. And it might state very clearly in that agreement that they cannot use the content outside of a certain period of time, let's say 12 months, 36 months, whatever. But if you've handed them your content, there's no way to know other than, doing the thing that kind of feels bad, which is kind of accusing them of using it outside the scope of the license. And maybe you have an audit clause or something to that effect where you can kind of go and check on those things. But that feels bad. It feels like that's a sad moment, I think, in a relationship with any customer that you're trying to build good relationships with. So you've got to have a way to share it, but turn it off. And if they want to keep using it, they got to renew the license with you in order to keep using it. And that's where a tool like SCORM Cloud Dispatch or Content Controller comes into play. It sets up this opportunity for recurring revenue. Content as a service was a term that we were using for a while in the early days, which I think sort of applies in this context. But you got to be able to turn it off in order for them to be forced to renew.
When we do our content controller training, this is the part where I usually say, yeah, Andy, I absolutely deleted your training.
Yeah.
I'm not using it anymore. But even further than that, like to past the feel bad moment, let's say you had a 5-year license. I know that probably seems long, but is the person that's assigning and administrating that content the same person you licensed to? Do they even have any idea that there's a license that they have to stop using it? They may not even know. But with Content Controller and with Dispatch, you can establish expiration dates, you can establish registration counts, learner limits, so that you can stop them when they need to be stopped, and then contact them and say, hey, it's time to renew.
And I love Rutherford's comment here. Like the client wasn't supposed to be using it, but they came back 5 years later because the course that they provided 5 years ago was built in Flash, and now Flash is dying and they need an upgraded course. But technically they don't have the rights to that course anymore, right? So like, that's an interesting moment where like, it's sort of like, oh, we got you. We would have got you like 5 years ago, and been able to have this recurring revenue in place. And it's, it's just one of the pitfalls of handing over content that we try to solve with some of our solutions.
We talked a little bit, I think Andy did briefly, on revisions and versioning. That can always be a headache if you have to do it the old way, but how are updates to content handled, and how can they make the process easier for their clients?
So when we talk to folks, and I'll start with Content Controller, and then we can talk about cloud, but it handles mostly the same way. But one of the moments in our Content Controller training that light bulbs go on, people get excited, or as excited as they can get talking about learning standards, is when we show off versioning. And what we end up doing in Content Controller is we have this global content pool that is all of your content that you are sharing out to folks. You would version your content, any revisions, anything that you needed to be updated, you would version it there. So you'd upload a new version, and then you would publish it. Now, when you publish in Content Controller, you're challenged to think about what to do with your folks who are maybe in flight with your content, but not completed it. So someone who has started the content, it's incomplete, maybe they've closed it and then they walked away. So they're incomplete. Do I want them to start over on the new version, or do I want them to continue on the old version, finish out, and then if they get assigned it again later, they'll get the new version? And when you publish and when you make that choice, it is going to push that content out to all of the accounts that have that content. So you're removing so many barriers. You are getting around maybe an LMS that you're delivering to that can't version, which is a thing. You're getting around the LMS administrator's work queue. When you send something to them, they might have other things going on. And you're taking those barriers out of the way, and you're pushing the good content out to the learners. But the one thing we do mention to people is, if you are, maybe pushing out like an OSHA 10 or an OSHA 30, and you maybe have someone 9 hours into a piece of training and incomplete, they probably are going to get upset with you if you start them over. So be aware of the content you're versioning and how you version it. But SCORM Cloud works a similar way, in that there is a setting called Move Existing Registrations to New Version When. It's a little bit different. It's a toggleable function that you can choose when to move those folks who are incomplete. Another question we get was, you say they're in flight. Does that mean I'm in the course right now? Am I going to see wonky behavior? And the answer is no, we'll leave you alone. But if you are incomplete and you've walked away, you are out of the course, then you are subject to the choice that the content controller administrator made.
Yeah, and I'll just tack on that you talk about like the efficiencies that brings to our customer, but it's a far improved experience for your customer or whoever's dealing with it, right? Like that, like to know, to have the assurance on your customer side that their learners are always getting the most up-to-date version of that course, no matter what, without LMS administrators having to do anything after they've imported that initial proxy package, I think is a real valuable part of the solution ultimately that we're collectively providing to the customer, and it just builds a better relationship. It's just you're the content provider that is the easiest to work with, which is great.
Okay, and one last question: what data is shared with the third-party launching LMS?
Yep, like Joe mentioned, it just has to deal with whatever standard the proxy package conforms with. So if it's SCORM 1.2, we're going to share SCORM 1.2 data. If it's LTI, we're going to share LTI data. So it all depends on that third-party LMS and what standard they support and what standard you share the proxy package as.
I think a good thing to add, and I don't know if the question asker was heading down this route too. We are going to send that data to them in a language they understand, and it's just going to be the normal SCORM, we'll call it SCORM runtime. But as far as the data that is shared with the distributor, because you are still dealing with, we'll use SCORM as an example, the SCORM standard, and the SCORM standard does require some PII, some personally identifiable information, to be shared. Basically the two pieces are student name and student ID are going to be shared. In the content controller example, it's going to be shared with content controller. In cloud, it's going to be shared with cloud. Now, both places can hash that data. So that's an important thing, especially in, these days, that, people's information is sacred, and, people want to know where their information is. So something to consider when you are distributing content, having a way to hash that data, so that if somebody doesn't want a content controller administrator to know that Joe Donnelly took workplace harassment, and this is his email address or his employee ID, or God forbid his social security number, they don't have to see that. It'll be a big gross good. Find a way to hash that. Both cloud and content controller does that, as well as Rustici dispatch and engine.
Yeah.
All right, and I want to say thank you to everybody for joining us today, and thank you to Andy and Joe for answering all of your questions. We are doing these quarterly, so we'll be on the lookout for our next Ask Us Anything invites, and you will also receive a recording of this this webinar probably by the end of the week. And so yeah, look for that too in your email, and we'll provide all of those links that Tara was chatting out as well. So,
hey, Alicia, we got
Joe?
a question. Can we answer Karen's question real quick?
Yes, you can answer Karen's question.
Thank you. Karen Paulson, friend of the pod. If you publish your learning package in SCORM 2004 and put it in SCORM Cloud, what happens if the customer's LMS doesn't support SCORM 2004? So in SCORM Cloud in particular, if you're talking about dispatch, you're always going to be outputting a SCORM 1.2. So while your host course is going to be SCORM 2004 in cloud, that third party is going to have to be able to support SCORM 1.2. So they don't have to understand SCORM 2004. They just need to understand SCORM 1.2. That's all I have.
Yeah. If we didn't get, if you saved a question and want to ask, I know, ask us anything really is really the truth. So we would encourage you to reach out. If you've got product questions, I'm myself or Peter or Philip. We don't let Chris talk to people anymore. We'll be happy to jump on a call and talk through anything.
Yep, and as Sarah said, we'll send out a survey afterward with a question in there. And if you'd like us to reach out to you, just hit yes, and we will do that. So thank you.
Thanks, Alicia,
Right.
for running the show.
Yeah, you're the best, Alicia.
Oh, thanks, guys.
All right.
Thanks,
Thanks,
y'all.
everyone.